Hello, I'm Paul Zimmy Finn, and this is the Generation Report. Praise be to Nero's Neptune, the Titanic sails at dawn. Everybody's shouting, which side are you on? They are spoon-feeding Casanova to get him to feel more assured. Then they'll kill him with self-confidence after poisoning him with words. And the only sound that's left after the ambulances go is Cinderella sweeping up on Desolation Row. Bob Dylan. In my initial outline of what this episode would be, I envisioned something similar to my discussion of generations back in February. Ultimately, I changed course because there is obviously no way to approach the topic of men and women, or gender issues generally, with the idea that it's possible to discuss everything. With that in mind, my focus here will be on presenting a portrait of the state of relations between men and women in America in 2020, and on giving that portrait historical context by incorporating the generational theory of Strauss and Howe. One of my few issues with generational theory centers on its following contradiction. While Strauss and Howe postulate that social relationships in a society evolve throughout cycles of history, they also take for granted that those relationships are essentially incorruptible in the face of any changes that occur. To be more specific, over the course of time Strauss and Howe collaborated in their scholarship on generations, they did not envision the extent to which cultural, economic, and political forces might disrupt generational relationships and in the process exacerbate America's next crisis, the one we are living through today. And for as much as they missed the mark in anticipating where America's generational relationships were headed, they missed the mark on men and women the most. To be direct, relations between men and women, on an overall basis, have never been as strained in living memory as they are today. I can't say for certain that they've never been worse, period, but the big picture is a bitter one nonetheless. If generations in America have been drifting apart, then men and women in America have been breaking up. The reaction to the vice presidential debate of 2 weeks ago was merely the latest reflection of a growing discord between the genders. It is my assertion that, as things stand today, amid the nastiest election in modern American history and amid a crisis that is boiling over, the relationship between men and women in America may be at a breaking point. What might be called the gender circus that has become such a fixture of the news and American politics in recent years was made possible by fissures between men and women which have been steadily building for a long time. I'll refrain from recapping the big gender circus headlines from the past few years because they're familiar to everyone, but what ultimately finds its way into politics invariably springs forth in the culture first. And in the years after the Great Recession, the gender relations landscape became conspicuously more openly gender partisan and simultaneously awash in insistence on self-gratification. From its origins in everyday social relations and niche cultures, this growing sense of discord began to be expressed in a multitude of ways throughout the new online media, in the mainstream media, and ultimately in the public square. Academia played a big role as well, and for anyone interested in reading further on that subject, I highly recommend the writings and scholarship of Heather McDonald. By the 2016 presidential election cycle, this gender circus was fully entrenched in politics, and it has remained so ever since. The dismal condition and sour mood in which the relationship between men and women exists today in America is reflected in countless stories, trends, facts, and figures which would take days to recite in full. Here are just a few items which capture the condition and the mood as well as any. When polled by YouGov in 2016 on the question of what constituted their ideal relationship, and presented a spectrum of choices on a 7-response scale ranging from completely monogamous to completely non-monogamous, 51% of millennials under age 30, barely more than half, responded that their ideal relationship was completely monogamous. In March 2019, data released by the General Social Survey from researchers at the University of Chicago indicated that among Americans ages 18 to 34, 51%, more than half, did not have a committed romantic partner in 2018. In the 2018 congressional midterm elections, the party's support gap between how men voted versus how women voted was 23 percentage points, which was the largest gap observed since such data has been measured. A post-ABC poll released on September 27th of this year revealed that among likely voters in the upcoming presidential election, the party gap between the genders is 44 percentage points. Speaking of politics, the dating platforms OkCupid and Bumble have developed filters to make it unlikely that users with incompatible political views will be matched. In a Pew Research survey of nearly 5,000 single Americans conducted in October 2019, the percentage who responded that they were not looking for a serious relationship or casual dates was 50%. And according to the firm Legal Templates, during the initial 3 months of coronavirus lockdowns from March through June of this year, the number of married Americans who initiated divorce proceedings registered a 34% increase over the same period in 2019. 20% of those couples who sought divorce had been married for 5 months or less. This is where things stand between men and women in America in 2020. Things are bad and steadily growing worse, with the most alarming trends largely concentrated among the young. So, how did we get here and why? For several years, I've digested the insights of many scholars, writers, and commentators who have considered that question. The following is not necessarily the answer, but here is an answer which I leave for listeners to judge. In the 1960s, the idea that men and women are not natural and mutual complements, but rather interchangeable parts made different by social conditioning, emerged and began to gain traction. The gradual incorporation and mainstreaming of that idea over the years since is the primary reason we have arrived at this divide between men and women today. Ideas about relationships and about gender change when cultures change, and no era in modern American history oversaw more cultural change than the 1960s. But let me be clear about what I'm asserting. The sexual revolution was not the singular overriding cause of the gender divide that emerged out of this era, nor was the expansion of government via the Great Society, nor was the transformation of the workplace, nor was feminism per se. In the 60s, feminism had been around for more than a century, changes to the American workplace were already accelerating, government had been steadily expanding its role in American life for decades, and old sexual mores had been giving way to new ones for many years. The most significant transformation around gender that occurred in the 60s, which would leave its imprint upon all the other gender developments, was the rise of the pillar of belief that any differences between men and women had been socially inculcated to control individuals and suppress their desires, rather than manifest evidence that men and women are natural, social, and biological complements. This is why Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, marks such a cultural watershed, surpassing Hugh Hefner's Playboy philosophy and Helen Gurley Brown's Sex and the Single Girl, both of which were published around the same time. Hefner and Gurley Brown's writings focused largely on liberation and self-fulfillment for their own sakes. Friedan, by contrast, wrote of gender roles and gender relations in a much darker tone, continually invoking the post-war suburban home as a quote-unquote comfortable concentration camp. This social constructionist framing of gender discussions would subsequently be adopted by many leading voices in the second-wave feminist movement, and by the year 2000, the idea that men and women were fundamentally at odds with each other permeated the culture. One of the domains which underwent an especially dramatic transformation thanks to this gender orthodoxy was American education. And in the year 2000, one of the most direct observations of how education had changed was made by Strauss and Howe, writing about millennials in Millennials Rising. Quote, "Their leading edge is just now entering colleges whose gender studies departments are steeped in the conviction that males oppress females." Unquote. Speaking as a millennial who passed through college just a few years afterward, I can confirm that this observation was 100% accurate. Speaking as a millennial, I can affirm that this milieu of mistrust has spread far beyond higher education and has tarnished countless social interactions. I can't step into the shoes of older generations and presume what it was like to be a young adult during the 1960s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. I am comfortable saying, however, that I think older generations would be shocked by the degree to which the ways and means of dating, partnering, and even meeting people have degraded over just the past 10 to 15 years. A lot has been said about the impact of social media, and not without reason. But I maintain that the overriding reason for the epidemic of single millennials is a dissolution of basic trust between the genders that was the sure final outcome of the loss of the appreciation that men and women are complements rather than adversaries. In that sense, my generation has borne the brunt of an idea which came into being before we did ourselves. So where do things go from here? I can only speculate, but right now most trends are not pointing in a positive direction. According to data compiled by the Federal Reserve, in the first half of 2020, millennials controlled 4.6% of America's wealth, far below what earlier generations held at a comparable age, while the albatross of student debt still lingers over so many. Double-digit percentages of millennial men and women are living with their parents, continuing a trend that started over a decade ago. In a Pew survey conducted in 2019, just 30% of people ages 23 to 38 were living with both a spouse and at least one child. And as Dr. Charles Murray demonstrated in Coming Apart nearly a decade ago, marriage has increasingly become the domain of the college-educated, and especially of the college-educated and affluent. Of course, it's not an imperative that everyone marry and raise a family, but family in all its various forms remains the most fundamental social institution there is. In order for the millennials caught in the spiral of downward economic mobility to have a good chance at their own families, their present life circumstances will have to change course for the better soon. Furthermore, as the alarming singlehood numbers give testament to, economics alone will not solve the problem. Social trust will have to regenerate, and in a big way, for any improvement in millennials' economic standing to carry real meaning. That rebuilding of trust may have to be sufficient enough to include a political realignment that manages to narrow the yawning gap between men's and women's voting patterns. And that will likely only happen if a cultural readjustment occurs whereby men and women begin to recognize and appreciate their differences and complementary qualities again. Can all of these positive outcomes be realized? I don't know, but that will be some Rubik's Cube to try to solve. In closing, having studied Strauss and Howe's generational theory for a long time, I am convinced that wherever today's trends ultimately lead, the contours of America's gender landscape in the future will largely be determined within the next 10 years. The model upon which I base that prediction is America's last crisis era. The years that spanned the Great Depression and World War II, and the ethic of social cooperation and trust which came to define them, planted the seeds for the post-war society of suburbs and single-family homes that came after. Neither America's victory in World War II nor the social order that emerged afterward would have been possible without a nation of men and women who understood that their destinies were inextricably linked. Should the breaking up of men and women in America make a turnabout before this crisis is through, the chances that a reinvigorated, more cohesive society emerges on the other side will be improved. And if it should not, America will be permanently altered in ways that will affect not only millennials, but all of today's living generations as well as generations yet unborn. The choice, as always, is up to us. Please tune in to the next episode, Millennials in Crisis. Thank you for listening, stay safe, and may God bless America.